Chapter 31 O.W.L.S. Ron's euphoria at helping Gryffindor scrape the Quidditch Cup was such that he could not settle to anything next day. All he wanted to do was talk over the match, and Harry and Hermione found it very difficult to find an opening in which to mention Grove. Not that either of them tried very hard. Neither was keen to be the one to bring Ron back to reality in quite such a brutal fashion. As it was another fine, warm day, they persuaded him to join them in studying under the beech tree on the edge of the lake, where they stood less chance of being overheard than in the common room. Ron was not particularly keen on this idea at first. He was truly enjoying being patted on the back by Gryffindors walking past his chair, not to mention the occasional outbursts of Weasley is our king, but agreed after a while that some fresh air might do him good. They spread their books out in the shade of the beech tree and sat down while Ron talked them through his first save of the match for what felt like the dozenth time. Well, I mean, I'd already let in that one of Davies's, so I wasn't feeling that confident, but I don't know. When Bradley came toward me just out of nowhere, I thought, you can't do this. And I had about a second to decide which way to fly, because he looked like he was aiming for the right corner hoop. My right, obviously, his left. But I had a funny feeling that he was fainting, and so I took the chance and flew left. He's right, I mean. And, well, you saw what happened, he concluded modestly, sweeping his hair back quite unnecessarily so that it looked interestingly windswept and glancing around to see whether the people nearest to them, a bunch of gossiping third-year Hufflepuffs, had heard him. And then, when Chambers came at me about 5 minutes later, what? Ron said, stopping mid-sentence at the look on Harry's face. Why are you grinning? I'm not, said Harry quickly, looking down at his transfiguration nose and attempting to straighten his face. The truth was that Ron had just reminded Harry forcibly of another Gryffindor Quidditch player who had once had rumpling his hair under this very tree. I'm just glad we won, that's all. Oha lan. Babasını hatırlamış ha. Yes, said Ron, slowly savoring the words. We won. Did you see the look on Chang's face when Ginny got the snitch right out from under her nose? I suppose she cried, did she? Said Harry bitterly. Well, yeah, more out of temper than anything, though, Ron frowned slightly. But you saw her chuck her broom away when she got back to the ground, didn't you? Said Harry. Well, actually, no, Ron, said Hermione with a heavy sigh, putting down her book and looking at him apologetically. As a matter of fact, the only bit of the match Harry and I saw was Davis's first goal. Ron's carefully ruffled hair seemed too wild with disappointment. You didn't watch, he said faintly, looking from one to the other. You didn't see me make any of those saves. Well, no, said Hermione, stretching out a placatory hand toward him. But Ron, we didn't want to leave. We had to. Yes, said Ron, whose face was growing rather red. How come? It was Hagrid, said Harry. He decided to tell us why he's been covered in injuries ever since he got back from the Giants. He wanted us to go into the forest with him. We had no choice. You know how he gets. Anyway, the story was told in 5 minutes, by the end of which Ron's indignation had been replaced by a look of total incredulity. He brought one back and hid it in the forest. Yep, said Harry grimly. No, said Ron, as though by saying this he could make it untrue. No, he can't have. Well, he has, said Hermione firmly, grows about 16 feet tall, enjoys ripping up 20-foot pine trees, and knows me. She snorted as Hermie. Ron gave a nervous laugh, and Hagrid wants us to teach him English, yes, said Harry. He's lost his mind, said Ron in an almost aid voice. Yes, said Harmony irritably, turning a page of intermediate transfiguration and glaring at a series of diagrams showing an all turning into a pair of opera glasses. Yes, I'm starting to think he has, but unfortunately, he made Harry and me promise. Well, you're just going to have to break your promise. That's all, said Ron firmly. I mean, come on. You've got exams and we're about that far. He held up his hand to show thumb and forefinger a millimeter apart from being chucked out as it is. And anyway, remember Norbert? Remember Aragog? Have you ever come off better for mixing with any of Hagrid's monster mates? I know it's just that we promised, said Hermione in a small voice. Bu arada Norbert diyor. Grow up olacak, amlici. Amlici işin içinden çıkaran, amlici alt eden, temel etmen. Yani bayağı bir işlerine yarayacak. Ron smoothed his hair flat again, looking preoccupied. Well, he sighed, Hagrid hasn't been sacked yet, has he? He's hung on this long. Maybe he'll hang on till the end of term, and we won't have to go near Grove at all. The castle grounds were gleaming in the sunlight as though freshly painted. The cloudless sky smiled at itself in the smoothly sparkling lake. The satin green lawns rippled occasionally in a gentle breeze. June had arrived, but to the 5th years this meant only one thing. Their oars were upon them at last. Their teachers were no longer setting them homework. Lessons were devoted to reviewing those topics their teachers thought most likely to come up in the exams. The purposeful, feverish atmosphere drove nearly everything but the O.W.L.S from Harry's mind, though he did wonder occasionally during Potion's lessons whether Lupin had ever told Snape that he must continue giving Harry Okulumuzun tuition. If he had, then Snape had ignored Lupin as truly as he was now ignoring Harry. This suited Harry very well. He was quite busy and tense enough without extra classes with Snape, and to his relief, Hermione was much too preoccupied these days to badger him about Okulumuzun. She was spending a lot of time muttering to herself and had not laid out any F-clause for days. She was not the only person acting oddly as the O.W.L.S drew steadily nearer. Ernie Macmillan had developed an irritating habit of interrogating people about their study habits. How many hours do you think you're doing a day? He demanded of Harry and Ron as they queued outside herbology, a manic gleam in his eyes. I don't know, said Ron. A few, more or less than 8. Less, I suppose, said Ron, looking slightly alarmed. I'm doing 8, said Ernie, puffing out his chest. 8 or 9. I'm getting an hour in before breakfast every day. 8's my average. I can do 10 on a good weekend day. I did 9.5 on Monday, not so good on Tuesday, only 7.25, then on Wednesday. Then on Wednesday derken, he was deeply thankful that Professor Sprout ushered them into greenhouse 3 at that point. Bir dakika, ne diyor bu? He was deeply thankful that Professor Sprout ushered them into greenhouse 3 at that point. Ha, diyor ben de ushered them 3 derken hani üçünü içeri aldı gibi bir şey aldım, aslında öyle değil. Koca bütün sınıfı al diyor. Hani greenhouse 3, bir sürü greenhouse var. 3 numaralı greenhouse'a giriyorlar yani öyle. Forcing Ernie to abandon his recital. Meanwhile, Draco Malfoy had found a different way to induce panic. Benim babamın arkadaşları var falan diyecek. Çok az buçuk hatırlıyor gibiyim ama bayağı hatırlamıyorum. Yani doğru çıkarsa tahminim başarı. Bakıyoruz. Of course it's not what you know. He was heard to tell Crabbe and Goyle loudly outside Potions a few days before the exams were to start. It's who you know. Now, Father's been friendly with the head of the Wizarding Examinations Authority for years, old Griselda Marchbanks. We've had her round for dinner and everything. Do you think that's true? Hermione whispered to Harry and Ron, looking frightened. Nothing we can do about it, if it is, said Ron gloomily. I don't think it's true, said Neville quietly from behind them. because Griselda Marchbanks is a friend of my grand's, and she's never mentioned the Malfoys. What's she like, Neville asked Hermione at once. Is she strict? Bit like Gran, really, said Neville in a subdued voice. Knowing her won't hurt your chances, though, will it? Ron told him encouragingly. Oh, I don't think it will make any difference, said Neville, still more miserably. Gran's always telling Professor Marchbanks I am not as good as my dad. Well, you saw what she is like at St. Mungo's. Neville looked fixedly at the floor. Harry, Ron, and Hermione glanced at one another, but didn't know what to say. It was the first time that Neville had acknowledged that they had met at the Wizarding Hospital. Meanwhile, a flourishing black market trade in aids to concentration, mental agility, and wakefulness had sprung up among the 5th and 7th years. Harry and Ron were much tempted by the bottle of Baruffio's brain elixir offered to them by Ravenclaw 6th year A.T. Carmichael, who swore it was solely responsible for the 9 outstanding O's he had gained the previous summer and was offering the whole pint for a mere 12 galleons. Ron assured Harry he would reimburse him for his half the moment he left Hogwarts and got a job. But before they could close the deal, Hermione had confiscated the bottle from Carmichael and poured the contents down the toilet. Hermione, we wanted to buy that, shouted Ron. Don't be stupid, she snarled. You might as well take Harold Dingle's powdered dragon claw and have done with it. Dingle's got powdered dragon claw, said Ron eagerly. Not anymore, said Hermione. I confiscated that too. None of these things actually works, you know. Dragon claw does work, said Ron. It's supposed to be incredible. Really gives your brain a boost. Really gives your brain a boost. You come over all cunning for a few hours. Hermione, let me have a pinch. Go on. It can't hurt. This stuff can, said Hermione grimly. I've had a look at it, and it's actually dried doxy droppings. This information took the edge off Harry and Ron's desire for brain stimulants. Bu stimulants da tam bir psikoloji lafı. Öyle. Yani direkt böyle psikoloji 101 derslerinden görüntüler, belli belirsiz kelimeler geliyor aklıma ve hiç hoş hissetmiyorum. Çünkü maalesef bölümden bağımsız olarak her ders ezbere dayalı olduğu için hepsi böyle iğrenç kelimelere sahipler. Mesela felsefede bu ne? Determinizm falan mı? Yok. Determinizm falan demedik. Neydi lan o? Vicious circularity falan. Nefret ediyorum o circularity falan. They received their examination schedules and details of the procedure for all during their next transfiguration lesson. As you can see, Professor McGonagall told the class while they copied down the days and times of their exams from the blackboard. Your O's are spread over 2 successive weeks. You will sit the theory exams in the mornings and the practice in the afternoons. Your practical astronomy examination will, of course, take place at night. Now, I must warn you that the most stringent anti-cheating charms have been applied to your examination papers. All the answer quills are banned from the examination hall, as are remembrance, detachable cribbing cuffs, and self-correcting ink. Every year, I'm afraid to say, seems to harbor at least one student who thinks that he or she can get around the Wizarding Examinations Authority's rules. I can only hope that it is nobody in Gryffindor or new headmistress. Professor McGonagall pronounced the word with the same look on her face that Aunt Petunia had whenever she was contemplating a particularly stubborn bit of dirt. Has asked the heads of house to tell their students that cheating will be punished most severely because, of course, your examination results will reflect upon headmistress's new regime at the school. Professor McGonagall gave a tiny sigh. Harry saw the nostrils of her sharp-nosed flare. However, this is no reason not to do your very best. You have your own futures to think about. Please, Professor, said Hermione, her hand in the air. When will we find out our results? "An O will be sent to you sometime in July," said Professor McGonagall. "Excellent," said Dean Thomas in an audible whisper, "so we don't have to worry about it till the holidays." He imagined sitting in his bedroom in Privet Drive in 6 weeks' time, waiting for his own results. Well, he thought, at least he would be sure of one bit of post next summer. Their first exam, Theory of Charms, was scheduled for Monday morning. He agreed to test Harmony after lunch on Sunday, but he regretted it almost at once. She was very agitated and kept snatching the book back from him to check that she had gotten the answer completely right, finally hitting him hard on the nose with the sharp edge of achievements in charming. "Why don't you just do it yourself?" he said firmly, handing the book back to her, his eyes watering. Meanwhile, Ron was reading 2 years of Charm's nose with his fingers in his ears, his lips moving soundlessly. Seamus was lying flat on his back on the floor, reciting the definition of a substantive charm, while Dean checked it against the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 5, and Parvati and Lavender, who were practicing basic locomotion charms, were making their pencil cases race each other around the edge of the table. Dinner was a subdued affair that night. Harry and Ron did not talk much, but ate with gusto, having studied hard all day. Hermione, on the other hand, kept putting down her knife and fork and diving under the table for her bag, from which she would seize a book to check some fact or figure. Ron was just telling her that she ought to eat a decent meal or she would not sleep that night, when her fork slid from her limp fingers and landed with a loud tinkle on her plate. "Oh my goodness," she said faintly, staring into the entrance hall. "Is that them? Is that the examiners?" Harry and Ron whipped around on their bench. Through the doors to the great hall, they could see Umbridge standing with a small group of ancient-looking witches and wizards. Umbridge, Harry was pleased to see, looked rather nervous. "Shall we go and have a closer look?" said Ron. Harry and Hermione nodded, and they hastened toward the double doors into the entrance hall, slowing down as they stepped over the threshold to walk sedately past the examiners. Harry thought Professor Marchbanks must be the tiny, stooped witch with a face so lined it looked as though it had been draped in cobwebs. Umbridge was speaking to her very defensively. Professor Marchbanks seemed to be a little deaf. She was answering Umbridge very loudly, considering that they were only a foot apart. "Journey was fine. Journey was fine. We made it plenty of times before," she said impatiently. "Now, I haven't heard from Dumbledore lately," she added, peering around the hall as though hopeful he might suddenly emerge from a broom cupboard. "No idea where he is, I suppose?" "Not at all," said Umbridge, shooting a malevolent look at Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who were now dawdling around the foot of the stairs as Ron pretended to do up his shoelace. "But I dare say the Ministry of Magic will track him down soon enough." "I doubt it," shouted tiny Professor Marchbanks. "Not if Dumbledore doesn't want to be found. I should know. Examined him personally in Transfiguration and Charms when he did nudes. Did things with a wand I'd never seen before. Did things with a wand I'd never seen before." O yaştaki bir çocuk, daha Dumbledore o zaman çocuktu işte newtlerini alırken, yaptığı şeyleri ben hayatımda hiç görmediydim diyor. "Yes, well," said Professor Umbridge as Harry, Ron, and Hermione dragged their feet up the marble staircase as slowly as they dared. "Let me show you to the staff room. I dare say you'd like a cup of tea after your journey." It was an uncomfortable sort of an evening. Everyone was trying to do some last-minute studying, but nobody seemed to be getting very far. He went to bed early, but then lay awake for what felt like hours. He remembered his careers consultation and McGonagall's furious declaration that she would help him become an author if it was the last thing she did. He wished he had expressed a more achievable ambition now that the exam time was here. He knew that he was not the only one lying awake, but none of the others in the dormitory spoke, and finally, one by one, they fell asleep. None of the fifth years talked very much at breakfast next day either. Parvati was practicing incantations under her breath while the salt cellar in front of her twitched. Harmony was rereading Achievement in Charming so fast that her eyes appeared blurred, and Neville kept dropping his knife and fork and knocking over the marmalade. Once breakfast was over, the fifth and seventh years milled around in the entrance hall while the other students went off to lessons. Then at 9:30, they were called forward class by class to re-enter the great hall, which was now arranged exactly as Harry had seen it in the pensive when his father, Sirius, and Snape had been taking their oaths. The four house tables had been removed and replaced instead with many tables for one, all facing the staff table end of the hall where Professor McGonagall stood facing them. When they were all seated and quiet, she said, "You may begin," and turned over an enormous hourglass on the desk beside her, on which were also spare quills, ink bottles, and rolls of parchment. He turned over his paper, his heart thumping hard. 3 rows to his right and 4 seats ahead, Hermione was already scribbling. He lowered his eyes to the first question. A. Give the incantation. And B. Describe the wand movement required to make objects fly. He had a fleeting memory of a club soaring high into the air and landing loudly on the thick skull of a troll. Smiling slightly, he bent over the paper and began to write. But it wasn't too bad, was it? Asked Hermione, anxiously in the entrance hall 2 hours later, still clutching the exam paper. I'm not sure I did myself justice on cheating charms. I just ran out of time. Did you put in the counter charm for hiccups? I wasn't sure whether I ought to. It felt like too much. And on question 23, Hermione said Ron sternly, we've been through this before. We're not going through every exam afterward. It's bad enough doing them once. The 50 years ate lunch with the rest of the school. The 4 house tables reappeared over the lunch hour, and then trooped off into the small chamber beside the great hall, where they were to wait until called for their practical examination. As small groups of students were called forward in alphabetical order, those left behind muttered incantations and practiced wand movements, occasionally poking one another in the back or eye by mistake. Hermione's name was called. Trembling, she left the chamber with Anthony Goldstein, Gregory Goyle, and Daphne Greengrass. Students who had already been tested did not return afterward, so Harry and Ron had no idea how Hermione had done. She'll be fine. Remember, she got 112% on one of our charms tests, said Ron. 10 minutes later, Professor Flitwick called. Parkinson, Pansy, Patil Padma, Patil Parvati, Potter, Harry. Good luck, said Ron quietly. Harry walked into the great hall, clutching his wand so tightly his hand shook. Professor Toft is free, Potter, squeaked Professor Flitwick, who was standing just inside the door. He pointed Harry toward what looked like the very oldest and boldest examiner, who was sitting behind a small table in a far corner, a short distance from Professor Marchbanks, who was halfway through tasting Draco Malfoy. Potter is it, said Professor Tofty, consulting his nose and peering over his pin's nose at Harry as he approached. The famous Potter. Out of the corner of his eye, he distinctly saw Malfoy throw a scathing look over at him. The wine glass Malfoy had been levitating fell to the floor and smashed. He could not suppress a grin. Professor Tofty smiled back at him encouragingly. This it is said in his quavery old voice. No need to be nervous. Now, if I could ask you to take this egg cup and make it do some cartwheels for me. On the whole, Harry thought it went rather well. His levitation charm was certainly much better than Malfoy's had been, though he wished he had not mixed up the incantations for color change and growth charms, so that the rat he was supposed to be turning orange swelled shockingly and was the size of a badger before he could rectify his mistake. He was glad Hermione had not been in the hall at the time and neglected to mention it to her afterward. He could tell Ron, though. Ron had caused the dinner plate to mutate into a large mushroom and had no idea how it had happened. There was no time to relax that night. They went straight to the common room after dinner and submerged themselves in studying for transfiguration next day. Bu transfiguration da bu şeyin matematiği gibi bir şey bence. Normal muggle'ların. Hani bir şekilde üstüne makaleler yazılıyor falan. Transfiguration Today falan böyle dergiler vardı sanki. Hani böyle bir bayağı sayısal bir şey. Hani bizdeki sayısal dediğimiz olay neyse Transfiguration'da bence o şeydi. Büyücü dünyasında diyeyim. Düşün Abdullah. Öyle. Aynen. Devam. There was no time to relax that night. They went straight to the common room after dinner and submerged themselves in studying for transfiguration next day. He went to bed, his head buzzing with complex spell models and theories. He forgot the definition of a switching spell during his written exam next morning, but thought his practical could have been a lot worse. At least he managed to vanish the whole of his iguana, whereas poor Hannah both lost her head completely at the next table and somehow managed to multiply her ferret into a flock of flamingos, causing the examination to be halted for 10 minutes while the birds were captured and carried out of the hall. They had their herbology exam on Wednesday. Other than a small bite from a fanged geranium, he felt he had done reasonably well. And then on Thursday, defense against the dark arts. Here for the first time, he felt sure he had passed. He had no problem with any of the written questions and took particular pleasure during the practical examination in performing all the contradictions and defensive spells right in front of Umbridge, who was watching coolly from near the doors into the entrance hall. "Oh, bravo!" cried Professor Tofty, who was examining Harry again, when Harry demonstrated a perfect Boggart banishing spell. "Very good indeed. Well, I think that's all, Potter, unless..." He leaned forward a little. "I heard from my dear friend Tiberius Ogden that you can produce a Patronus for a bonus point." He raised his wand, looked directly at Umbridge, and imagined her being sacked. "Expecto Patronum." Hani the silver stag erupted from the end of his wand and countered the length of the hall. All of the examiners looked around to watch its progress, and when it dissolved into silver mist, Professor Tofty clapped his veined and knotted hands enthusiastically. "Excellent," he said. "Very well, Potter. You may go." Bir dakika şurayı bir daha okuyacağım. The silver stag erupted from the end of his wand and countered the length of the hall. All of the examiners looked around to watch its progress, and when it dissolved into silver mist, Professor Tofty clapped his veined and knotted hands enthusiastically. Tam olarak diğer insanlar nasıl bir tepki vermişler onu iyi anlamak istedim. As he passed Umbridge beside the door, their eyes met. There was a nasty smile playing around her wide, slack mouth, but he did not care. Unless he was very much mistaken, and he was not planning on saying it to anybody in case he was, he had just achieved an outstanding all. On Friday, Harry and Ron had a day off while Hermione sat her ancient Williams exam, and as they had the whole weekend in front of them, they permitted themselves a break from studying. They stretched and yawned beside the open window, through which warm summer air wafted over them as they played a desultory game of wizard chess. Desultory. Bu da böyle bir tarafın aşırı derecede ciddi bir yenilgiye uğradığı gibi bir anlam veriyor bana. Emin değilim. Güzel kelimeymiş. Desultory falan. Böyle yazımı, görüntüsü, söylenişi böyleyse söylenişi falan bayağı ilgi çekici bir kelime bence. He could see Hagrid in the distance, teaching a class on the edge of the forest. He was trying to guess what creatures they were examining. He thought it must be unicorns, because the boy seemed to be standing back a little. When the portrait hole opened and Hermione clambered in, looking truly bad-tempered. Over the room, said Ron, yawning and stretching. I mistranslated O.W.L.S, said Hermione furiously. It means partnership, not defense. I mixed it up with A.W.L.S. O.W.L, said Ron lazily. There's only one mistake, isn't it? You'll still get... Oh, shut up, said Hermione angrily. It could be the one mistake that makes a difference between a pass and a fail. And what's more, someone's put another niffler in Umbridge's office. I don't know how they got it through that new door, but I just walked past there and Umbridge is striking her head off. By the sound of it, it tried to take a chunk out of her leg. Good, said Harry and Ron together. It is not good, said Hermione hotly. She thinks it's Hagrid doing it, remember? And we do not want Hagrid chucked out. He's teaching at the moment. She can't blame him, said Harry, gesturing out of the window. Oh, you're so naive sometimes, Harry. You really think Umbridge will wait for proof, said Hermione, who seemed determined to be in a towering temper, and she swept off toward the girls' dormitories, banging the door behind her. Such a lovely, sweet-tempered girl, said Ron, very quietly, prodding his queen forward so that she could begin beating up one of Harry's knights. Hermione's bad mood persisted for most of the weekend, though Harry and Ron found it quite easy to ignore as they spent most of Saturday and Sunday studying for portions on Monday. Though Harry and Ron found it quite easy to ignore as they spent most of Saturday and Sunday studying for portions on Monday, the exam to which Harry was looking forward least, and which he was sure would be the one that would be the downfall of his ambitions to become an author. Sure enough, he found the written exam difficult, though he thought he might have got full marks on the question about Polyjuice Potion. He could describe its effects extremely accurately, having taken it illegally in his second year. The afternoon practical was not as dreadful as he had expected it to be. With Snape absent from the proceedings, he found that he was much more relaxed than he usually was while making potions. Neville, who was sitting very near Harry, also looked happier than Harry had ever seen him during a potions class. When Professor Marchbanks said, "Step away from your cauldrons, please. The examination is over," he corked his sample flask, feeling that he might not have achieved a good grade, but that he had, with luck, avoided a fail. "Only 4 exams left," said Parvati Patil wearily as they headed back to Gryffindor common room. "Only," said Hermione snappishly. "I've got arithmancy and it's probably the toughest subject there is." Şey değilmiş ha. Transfiguration değilmiş, aritmansiymiş. Bu aritmansiym aslında matematik gibi bir şeydi. Bu durumda fizik falan oluyor transfiguration. Fizik daha güzel bir tahmin. Onlar da böyle görüntüsünü falan değiştiriyorlar ya. Yani büyücüler transfiguration'da bir şeylerin görüntüsünü değiştiriyor. Fizikte zaten görünüşlerin ne bileyim varoluşun birimi gibi bir şey değilmiş. Yani ne kadar doğru bir tanım yapıyorum emin değilim ama öyle öğretmensin. Matematik bence zaten aritmetik falan böyle bir şey var. Kelime kökeni var yani. Belki bunda şey vardır lan. Çevirisi aritmansi yokmuş. Ama yine bir Türkçesini gördük en azından. Neyse öyle. Yani transfiguration büyük ihtimal. Fizik, aritmansi de matematik. Nobody was foolish enough to snap back, so she was unable to vent her spleen on any of them and was reduced to telling off some first years for giggling too loudly in the common room. He was determined to perform well in Tuesday's Care of Magical Creatures exam so as not to let Hagrid down. The practical examination took place in the afternoon on the lawn on the edge of the Forbidden Forest, where students were required to correctly identify the gnarl hidden among a dozen hedgehogs. The trick was to offer them all milk in turn. Nars, highly suspicious creatures whose quills had many magical properties, generally went berserk at what they saw as an attempt to poison them, then demonstrate correct handling of a bowtruckle, feed and clean a fire crab without sustaining serious burns, and choose from a wide selection of food the diet they would give a sick unicorn. He could see Hagrid watching anxiously out of his cabin window. When Harry's examiner, a plump little witch this time, smiled at him and told him he could leave, Harry gave Hagrid a fleeting thumbs up before heading back up to the castle. The astronomy theory exam on Wednesday morning went well enough. Harry was not convinced he had, bak ya, üstüne gelsem yetiyor yani, basmıyorum bile hava durumu şeyine. Bunu yok edeceğim abi. Git şuradan. Gitti. Bir dakika. The astronomy theory exam on Wednesday morning went well enough. Harry was not convinced he had got the names of all of Jupiter's moons right, but was at least confident that none of them was inhabited by mice. They had to wait. Bu da şeye gönderme. Hani en son Hermione buna kıyamayıp tamam verin ödevlerinizi ben yapacağım dediydi ya, o ara işte Harry mice'a okunuşu baya benzeyen bir kelimeyi mice diye yazıp karıştırmış işte falan. Harry ona gönderme yapıyor. Hermione orada Harry'i düzeltmesine gönderme yapıyor. They had to wait until evening for their practical astronomy. The afternoon was devoted instead to divination. Even by Harry's low standards in divination, the exam went very badly. He might as well have tried to see moving pictures in the desktop as in the stubbornly blank crystal ball. He lost his head completely during tea leaf reading, saying it looked to him as though Professor Marchbanks would shortly be meeting around dark, soggy stranger, and rounded off the whole fiasco by mixing up the life and headlines on her palm and informing her that she ought to have died the previous Tuesday. Well, we were always going to fail that once, said Ron gloomily as they ascended the marble staircase. He had just made Harry feel rather better by telling him how he told the examiner in detail about the ugly man with a wart on his nose and his crystal ball, only to look up and realize he had been describing his examiner's reflection. We shouldn't have taken the stupid subject in the first place, said Harry. Still, at least we can give it up now. Yes, said Harry, no more pretending we care what happens when Jupiter and Uranus get too friendly. And from now on, I don't care if my tea leaves spell die, Ron, die. I'm just chucking them in the bin where they belong. Harry laughed just as Hermione came running up behind them. He stopped laughing at once in case it annoyed her. Well, I think I've done all right in arithmancy, she said, and Harry and Ron both sighed with relief. Just time for a quick look over our star charts before dinner, then. When they reached the top of the astronomy tower at 11 o'clock, they found a perfect night for stargazing, cloudless and still. The grounds were better than silvery moonlight, and there was a slight chill in the air. Each of them set up his or her telescope, and when Professor Marchbanks, Truman Burbank, onu da söyledi Burbank, ikisinde de bank var. Marchbanks gave the word, proceeded to fill in the blank star chart he or she had been given. Professor Marchbanks and Tofty strolled among them, watching as they entered the precise positions of the stars and planets they were observing. All was quiet, except for the rustle of parchment, the occasional creak of a telescope as it was adjusted on its stand, and the scribbling of many quills. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The little squares of reflected gold light flickering on the ground below started to vanish as lights in the castle windows were extinguished. As he completed the constellation Orion on his chart, however, the front doors of the castle opened directly below the parapet where he was standing, so that light spilled down the stone steps a little way across the lawn. Harry glanced down as he made a slight adjustment to the position of his telescope and saw 5 or 6 elongated shadows moving over the brightly lit grass before the doors swung shut and the lawn became a sea of darkness once more. He put his eye back to his telescope and refocused it, not examining Venus. He looked down at his chart to enter the planet there. But something distracted him. Pausing with his quill suspended over the parchment, he squinted down into the shadowy grounds and saw half a dozen figures walking over the lawn. If they had not been moving and the moonlight had not been gilding the tops of their heads, they would have been indistinguishable from the dark ground on which they stood. Even at this distance, he had a funny feeling that he recognized the walk of the squattest among them, who seemed to be leading the group. He could not think why Amrich would be taking a stroll outside past midnight, much less accompanied by 5 others. Then somebody coughed behind him, and he remembered that he was halfway through an exam. He had quite forgotten Venus's position. Jamming his eye to his telescope, he found it again and was again on the point of entering it on his chart when, alert for any odd sound, he heard a distant knock that echoed through the deserted grounds, followed immediately by the muffled barking of a large dog. He looked up, his heart hammering. There were lights on in Hagrid's windows, and the people he had observed crossing the lawn were now silhouetted against them. The door opened, and he distinctly saw 6 tiny but sharply defined figures walk over the threshold. The door closed again, and there was silence. He felt very uneasy. He glanced around to see whether Ron or Hermione had noticed what he had, but Professor Marchbanks came walking behind him at that moment, and not wanting to appear as though he was sneaking looks at anyone else's work, he hastily bent over his star chart and pretended to be adding notes to it while really peering over the top of the parapet toward Hagrid's cabin. Figures were now moving across the cabin windows, temporarily blocking the light. He could feel Professor Marchbanks's eyes on the back of his neck and pressed his eye again to his telescope, staring up at the moon, though he had marked its position an hour ago. But as Professor Marchbanks moved on, he heard a roar from the distant cabin that echoed through the darkness right to the top of the astronomy tower. Several of the people around here ducked out from behind their telescopes and peered instead in the direction of Hagrid's cabin. Professor Tofty gave another dry little cough. "Try and concentrate now, boys and girls," he said softly. Most people returned to their telescopes. He looked to his left. Hermione was gazing transfixed at Hagrid's. "Ahem, 20 minutes to go," said Professor Tofty. Hermione jumped and returned at once to her star chart. Harry looked down at his own and noticed that he had mislabeled Venus as Mars. He bent to correct it. There was a loud bang from the grounds. Several people said ouch as they poked themselves in the face with ends of their telescopes, hastening to see what was going on below. Hagrid's door had burst open, and by the light flooding out of the cabin, they saw him quite clearly, a massive figure roaring and brandishing his fists, surrounded by 6 people, all of whom, judging by the tiny threads of red light they were casting in his direction, seemed to be attempting to stun him. "No," cried Hermione. "My dear," said Professor Tofty in a scandalized voice, "this is an examination." But nobody was paying the slightest attention to their star charts anymore. Jets of red light were still flying beside Hagrid's cabin, yet somehow they seemed to be bouncing off him. He was still upright and still, as far as Harry could see, fighting. Cries and yells echoed across the grounds. A man yelled, "Be reasonable, Hagrid," and Hagrid roared, "Reasonable be damned! You won't take me like this, Dawlish." He could see the tiny outline of Fane attempting to defend Hagrid, leaping at the wizards surrounding him until a stunning spell caught him and he fell to the ground. Hagrid gave a howl of fury, lifted the culprit bodily from the ground, and threw him. The man flew The man flew what looked like 10 feet and did not get up again. Ha böyle Feng'i sersemleten adamı alıyor, tutup atıyor böyle adam da bayılıyor gibi bir şey oluyor. The man flew what looked like 10 feet and did not get up again. Hermione gasped, both hands over her mouth. He looked around at Ron and saw that he too was looking scared. None of them had ever seen Hagrid in a real temper before. Look, squealed Parvati, who was leaning over the parapet and pointing to the foot of the castle where the front doors seemed to have opened again. More light had spilled out onto the dark lawn, and a single long black shadow was now rippling across the lawn. Now, really, said Professor Toft anxiously, only 16 minutes left, you know. But nobody paid him the slightest attention. They were watching the person now sprinting toward the battle beside Hagrid's cabin. How dare you, the figure shouted as she ran. How dare you? It's McGonagall, whispered Hermione. Leave him alone. Alone, I say, said Professor McGonagall's voice through the darkness. On what grounds are you attacking him? He has done nothing, nothing to warrant such. Hermione, Parvati, and Lavender all screamed. No fewer than 4 stunners had shot from the figures around the cabin toward Professor McGonagall. No fewer than 4 stunners had shot from the figures around the cabin toward Professor McGonagall. No fewer than 4 stunners had shot from the figures around the cabin. En az 4 tane sersemle McGonagall'a aynı anda çarpıyor. Halfway between cabin and castle, the red beams collided with her. For a moment she looked luminous, illuminated by an eerie red glow, then was lifted right off her feet, landed hard on her back, and moved no more. Galloping gargoyles, shouted Professor Tofty, who seemed to have forgotten the exam completely, not so much as a warning. Outrageous behavior, covers below Hagrid, his voice carrying clearly to the top of the tower, and several lights flickered on inside the castle. Ruddy covers, have some of that and that. Oh my, gasped Hermione. Hagrid took 2 massive swipes at his closest attackers. Judging by their immediate collapse, they had been knocked cold. Swipe mı neymiş? Taş mı? Sweeper. Ha, hani şamar. Türk tokadı atıyor. Hagrid took two... Bir dakika. Şamar falan demiyor of course da. Tokat, çalmak, geçmek, kuvvetli vurmak, hızlı vurmak, kuvvetli vuruş. Yumruk falan da oluyor herhalde. Hagrid took 2 massive swipes at his closest attackers. Judging by their immediate collapse, they had been knocked cold. He saw him double over and thought for a moment that he had finally been overcome by a spell. He saw him double over and thought for a moment that he had finally been overcome by a spell. But on the contrary, next moment Hagrid was standing again with what appeared to be a sack on his back. Then he realized that Fang's limp body was draped around his shoulders. Get him, screamed Umbridge, but the remaining helpers seemed highly reluctant to go within reach of Hagrid's fists. Indeed, he was backing away so fast, he tripped over one of his unconscious colleagues and fell over. Hagrid had turned and begun to run with Fang still hung around his neck. Umbridge sent one last stunning spell after him, but it missed, and Hagrid, running full pelt toward the distant gates, disappeared into the darkness. There was a long minute's quivering silence. Running full pelt toward the distant gates, disappeared into the darkness. Ormana girip kayboluyor, kapılardan mı geçiyor? Hangi kapı olduğunu anlamadım. Bir toward the distant gate, uzak kapılara doğru koşuyor. Bu Hogwarts arsasına giriş kapıları herhalde. There was a long minute's quivering silence. Everybody gazing, open-mouthed into the grounds. Then Professor Tofty's voice said feebly, 5 minutes to go, everybody. Though he had only filled in 2/3 of his chart, he was desperate for the end of the exam. When it came at last, he, Ron, and Hermione forced their telescopes haphazardly back into their holders and dashed back down the spiral staircase. None of the students were going to bed. They were all talking loudly and excitedly at the foot of the stairs about what they had witnessed. That evil woman, gasped Hermione, who seemed to be having difficulty talking due to rage, trying to sneak up on Hagrid in the dead of night. She clearly wanted to avoid another scene like Trelawney, said Ernie Macmillan sagely, squeezing over to join them. Hagrid did well, didn't he, said Ron, who looked more alarmed than impressed. How come all the spell bounced off him? It'll be his giant blood, said Hermione shakily. It's very hard to stun a giant. They're like trolls, really tough. But poor Professor McGonagall forced Stunner straight in the chest, and she's not exactly young, is she? Dreadful, dreadful, said Ernie, shaking his head pompously. Well, I'm off to bed. Night all. People around them were drifting away, still talking excitedly about what they had just seen. At least they didn't get to take Hagrid off to Azkaban, said Ron. I expect he's going to join Dumbledore, isn't he? I suppose so, said Hermione, who looked tearful. Oh, this is awful. I really thought Dumbledore would be back before long, but now we've lost Hagrid too. They traipsed back to the Gryffindor common room to find it full. The commotion out in the grounds had woken several people who had hastened to rouse their friends. Seamus and Dean, who had arrived ahead of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, were now telling everyone what they had heard from the top of the astronomy tower. But why say Hagrid now? Asked Angelina Johnson, shaking her head. It's not like Trelawney. He's been teaching much better than usual this year. Umbridge hates part humans, said Hermione bitterly, flopping down into an armchair. She was always going to try and get Hagrid out. And she thought Hagrid was putting nifflers in her office, piped up Kate Bell. Oh, blimey, said Lee Jordan, covering his mouth. It's me's been putting the nifflers in her office. Fred and George left me a couple. I've been levitating them in through her window. She'd have sacked him anyway, said Dean. He was too close to Dumbledore. That's true, said Harry, sinking into an armchair beside Hermione's. I just hope Professor McGonagall's all right, said Lavender tearfully. They carried her back up to the castle. We watched through the dormitory windows, said Colin Creevy. She didn't look very well. Madame Pomfrey will sort her out, said Alicia Spinnet firmly. She's never failed yet. It was nearly 4 in the morning before the common room cleared. Harry felt wide awake. The image of Hagrid sprinting away into the dark was haunting him. He was so angry with Umbridge, he could not think of a punishment bad enough for her, though Ron's suggestion of having her fed to a box of starving bloods and screws had its merits. He fell asleep, contemplating hideous revenges, and arose from bed 3 hours later, feeling distinctly unrested. Their final exam, History of Magic, was not to take place until that afternoon. Harry would very much have liked to go back to bed after breakfast, but he had been counting on the morning for a spot of last-minute studying. So instead, he sat with his head in his hands by the common room window, trying hard not to doze off as he read through some of the notes stacked 3.5 feet high that Hermione had lent him. The fifth years entered the great hall at 2 o'clock and took their places in front of their overturned examination papers. He felt exhausted. He just wanted this to be over so that he could go and sleep. Then tomorrow, he and Ron were going to go down to the Quidditch pitch. He was going to have a fly on Ron's broom and savor their freedom for Ron studying. Turn over your papers, said Professor Marchbanks from the front of the hall, flicking over the giant hourglass. You may begin. He stared fixedly at the first question. It was several seconds before it occurred to him that he had not taken in a word of it. There was a wasp buzzing distractingly against one of the high windows. Slowly, tortuously, he began to write an answer. He was finding it very difficult to remember names and kept confusing dates. He simply skipped question 4. In your opinion, did one legislation contribute to or lead to better control of goblin riots of the 18th century? Thinking that he would go back to it if he had time at the end. He had a stab at question 5. How was the statute of secrecy breached in 1749, and what measures were introduced to prevent a recurrence? But had a nagging suspicion that he had missed several important points. He had a feeling vampires had come into the story somewhere. He looked ahead for a question he could definitely answer, and his eyes alighted upon number 10. Describe the circumstances that led to the formation of the International Confederation of Wizards and explain why the warlords of Liechtenstein refused to join. I know this, he thought, though his brain felt torpid and slack. He could visualize a heading in Harmony's handwriting, the formation of the International Confederation of Wizards. He had read these notes only this morning. He began to write, looking up now and again to check the large hourglass on the desk beside Professor Marchbanks. He was sitting right behind Parvati Patil, whose long dark hair fell below the back of her chair. Once or twice he found himself staring at the tiny golden lights that glistened in it when she moved her head very slightly and had to give his own head a little shake to clear it. The first pre-mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards was Pierre Bonacourt, but his appointment was contested by the wizarding community of Liechtenstein because all around here quills were scratching on parchment like scurrying, burrowing rats. The sun was very hot on the back of his head. What was it that Bonacourt had done to offend the wizards of Liechtenstein? He had a feeling it had something to do with trolls. He gazed blankly at the back of Parvati's head again. If he could only perform legitimacy and open a window in the back of her head and see what it was about trolls that had caused the breach between Pierre Bonacourt and Liechtenstein. He closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands so that the glowing red of his eyelids grew dark and cool. Bonacourt had wanted to stop troll hunting and give the trolls rights, but Liechtenstein was having problems with a tribe of particularly vicious mountain trolls. That was it. He opened his eyes, his tongue and watered at the side of the blazing white parchment. Slowly he wrote 2 lines about the trolls, then read through what he had done so far. It did not seem very informative or detailed, yet he was sure Harmony's notes on the Confederation had gone on for pages and pages. He closed his eyes again, trying to see them, trying to remember. The Confederation had met for the first time in France. Yes, he had written that already. Goblins had tried to attend and been ousted. He had written that too. And nobody from Liechtenstein had wanted to come. Think, he told himself, his face in his hands, while all around him quills scratched out never-ending answers, and the sand trickled through the hourglass at the front. He was walking along the cool, dark corridor to the Department of Mysteries again, walking with a firm and purposeful tread, breaking occasionally into a run, determined to reach his destination at last. The black door swung open for him as usual, and here he was in the circular room with its many doors. Şimdi burada güzel bir nokta var bence. Bunu şu şekilde Harry görmedi ne olmadan önce, Hagrid kovulmadan önce, McGonagall hastanede yatmadan önce. Bir şekilde Flitwick ya da Sprout onlar order'da değiller Zümrüdüanka Yoldaşlığında. Düşün Abdullah. Hani görmedi bizimkiler onları. Ya böyle iş şeye geliyor. Acaba diyorum bir şekilde böyle Hagrid'in yollanması ve aynı zamanda eğer McGonagall gelirse onu sersemletilip bayıltılması hesaplanmış bir şey miydi? Hani sırf Harry böyle kendi başına Sirius'u kurtarmaya gitmeye kalkışacak mantığı kendinde bulabilsin diye. Bunu bir düşün Abdullah. Bence düşük bir ihtimal. Düşük ya. Hani aynı anda dördümüz sersemlet yapacağız McGonagall gelesiye falan. Böyle bir şey olduğunu çok düşünmüyorum yani. Aynen devam. He was walking along the cool, dark corridor to the Department of Mysteries again, walking with a firm and purposeful tread, breaking occasionally into a run, determined to reach his destination at last. The black door swung open for him as usual, and here he was in the circular room with its many doors. Straight across the stone floor and through the second door, patches of dancing light on the walls and floor, and that odd mechanical clicking, but no time to explore. He must hurry. He jogged the last few feet to the third door, which swung open just like the others. Once again, he was in the cathedral-sized room, full of shelves and glass spheres. His heart was beating very fast now. He was going to get there this time. When he reached number 97, he turned left and hurried along the aisle between two rows. But there was a shape on the floor at the very end, a black shape moving upon the floor like a wounded animal. His stomach contracted with fear, with excitement. A voice issued from his own mouth, a high, cold voice, empty of any human kindness. Take it for me, lift it down now. I cannot touch it, but you can. The black shape upon the floor shifted a little. He saw a long-fingered white hand clutching a wand rise on the end of his own arm, heard a high, cold voice say, Crucio. The man on the floor let out a scream of pain, attempted to stand but fell back, writhing. He was laughing. He raised his wand, the curse lifted, and the figure groaned and became motionless. Lord Voldemort is waiting. Very slowly, his arms trembling, the man on the ground raised his shoulders a few inches and lifted his head. His face was blood-stained and gaunt, twisted in pain yet rigid with defiance. You'll have to kill me, whispered Sirius. Undoubtedly I shall in the end, said the cold voice. But you will fidget for me first, Black. You think you have felt pain thus far? Think again. We have hours ahead of us and nobody to hear you scream. But somebody screamed as Voldemort lowered his wand again. Somebody yelled and fell sideways off a hot desk onto the cold stone floor. Somebody yelled and fell sideways off a hot desk onto the cold stone floor. He hit the ground and awoke, still yelling, his car on fire, as the great hall erupted all around him. Şimdi burada ben alamam sen alabilirsin falan diyor. Dedim ne diye Sirius alabiliyor falan. Sonra Sirius'un Harry'nin vaftiz babası olduğu fact'i var ortada. Hani bir şekilde sanki hani sadece Harry'nin yapabileceği şeylerden sadece Harry'nin yapabileceği şeylerden bazılarını Sirius yapabiliyor. Harry adına gibi oluyor çünkü. Çünkü Harry hala çocuk olduğu için Harry'nin vaftiz babası diyebileceği bir insana sanki büyüsel olarak bir yetki geliyormuş gibi bir his geldi bana. Bu durumda hani Sirius'u direkt Harry'nin kafasına Sirius'lu bir görüntü sokması, Voldemort'un klasik işte Harry Sirius'u sevdiği için Sirius oradaymış gibi davranayımdan fazlası var bence. Bir kere mantığa uyuyor. Hani cidden Sirius gidecek olsa alabiliyor bence kehaneti. Çünkü düşün Abdullah. Çünkü büyüde vaftiz babalık falan bir şekilde büyüde kişiye özelse bile bir büyü onun annesine babasına vaftiz annesine vaftiz babasına cert curt işte yetki veriyor bence. Bu durumda klasik Harry'nin en sevdiği adama işkence etmekten fazlası var bence burada. Yani hikayede kendi içinde tutarlı. Gayet gerçek olabilirdi bu olay yani. Durum bu. Diyecek bir şey var mı? Düşün Abdullah. No. Chapter 32. Out of the fire. Hadi görüşürüz.